On Thanksgiving morning of 2024, in a kitchen I had paid to remodel, with 11 people watching, my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and told me to wait in the garage until the real family finished eating. I'm Adeline Marsh. I'm 68 years old. I set down the pie I'd baked at 4 that morning, picked up my coat, and walked out the front door. By the following Friday I had taken back the house they were standing in, the truck parked out front, and every dollar they thought was theirs. If you're listening from somewhere far from Ohio, leave your town in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and stay with me to the end, because the part everybody remembers isn't the leaving, it's what I found in the safe deposit box 3 days later. Before I tell you about that morning, you need to know who I really am. Not the quiet old woman in the cardigan who brought side dishes and never argued. Not the soft target they thought they'd married into. Because the thing about being underestimated for 60 years is that you learn to keep records nobody knows you're keeping. I was born Adeline Rourke in 1956 in the coal town in southeastern Ohio that doesn't exist on most maps anymore. My father worked the mines until the dust took his lungs, and my mother cleaned the houses of the men who owned the mine. We had a saying in our family that I didn't understand until I was grown. My mother would say it whenever someone tried to cheat her at the market or shortchange her wages. Write it down, Addie. Memory fades, paper doesn't. She kept a ledger in a coffee can above the stove, and every dime that came in or went out of our house was in that book in her tight little handwriting. When she died, that ledger was the only thing of value she left. I still have it. I married young, like girls did then. His name was Russell Marsh, and he was a good man, which I say plainly because I've learned how rare that is. He drove a delivery route for a bakery distributor out of Columbus, gone before dawn, home after dark, smelling of diesel and bread. We didn't have much, but Russell believed in me in a way nobody ever had, and when I told him I wanted to go to night school for bookkeeping, he didn't laugh. He picked up Saturday shifts so we could afford the tuition. I got my certificate when I was 26, and I kept the books for half the small businesses in our county for the next 40 years. Funeral homes, auto shops, a diner, a hardware store. I knew where every family in 3 towns kept their money, and not one of them ever caught me in an error, because my mother taught me that a single misplaced decimal is a kind of lying. We had one son, Gregory, born in 1981, on the coldest night of that year, in a hospital 40 minutes away because the local one had closed. Russell drove through black ice with his hands shaking, and I remember thinking, looking at that red squalling baby, that I would spend my whole life making sure he never knew the kind of cold I grew up in. And I did. God help me, I did exactly that. Russell died in 2009. His heart on the highway on a Tuesday. They told me he wouldn't have felt much. People say that to you and they mean well, and it does nothing. I was 53. I had a paid-off house, a small life insurance settlement, and 40 years of careful bookkeeping that had left me with more savings than anyone who knew me would have guessed. I never spent on myself. I drove a 15-year-old Buick. I wore the same wool coat for a decade. People assumed I was getting by. I let them assume. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about being a widow at 53 with one grown son. You become a resource. Quietly, gradually, you stop being a person, and you become a thing that money comes out of. Gregory had married by then. Her name was Prevails, and the first time he brought her to my house, in 2007, she walked through my living room touching things the way you touch items in an estate sale, calculating. She came from money, or from people who acted like they had it, which in my experience is more dangerous. Her father owned 3 car dealerships down near Cincinnati and never let you forget it. Her mother corrected my grammar twice at our first dinner. I smiled and refilled their glasses and said nothing. And that night I wrote in my book the same way my mother did. Met Brielle's people. They look at me like I'm the help. Greg didn't notice a lot of things, and that was the wound that never closed. My son was not cruel. I want that understood. He was something almost worse. He was weak, and he was ashamed, and somewhere in his 20s he decided that the way to belong to Brielle's world was to file down every rough edge of where he came from, including me. It started small, the way these things do. He stopped calling me Mom in front of her family and started calling me Adeline, like I was an acquaintance. He'd correct the way I said certain words. He asked me, once, gently, if I might dress a little more put together for a dinner at Brielle's parents' club. I went and bought a blouse I couldn't justify the price of, and her mother told me it was a brave color. I wore it home and never put it on again. I wrote that down too. In 2014, Greg and Brell wanted a house, a real house, the kind that signals you've arrived. There was a property in a development outside Dublin, north of Columbus, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen with an island the size of my first bedroom, a price tag of $410,000. They had the income to almost manage it, almost. They were short on the down payment, and Brielle's father, for all his 3 dealerships, declined to help, because he had decided his daughter needed to learn to stand on her own. Which meant they came to me. I remember the conversation at my kitchen table. Greg did the talking. Brielle sat with her hands folded, letting him beg on her behalf. They needed $80,000. Greg's voice cracked when he asked, and for a moment he was my boy again, the one I drove through the cold to deliver, and I felt the old pull, the one that had been emptying my accounts in small ways for years. But my mother's voice was louder. Write it down. Protect yourself. I'll give you the 80,000, I said, on one condition. Brielle's chin lifted. What condition? My name goes on the deed. Co-owner, in writing. The silence in that kitchen could have cracked a window. Brielle's face did a thing I'll never forget, a sort of flinch and recalculation all at once. That's not really how it's done, Adeline, she said. It's our home. Then it'll be partly mine on paper, I said. $80,000 of mine. I'm not asking for the house. I'm asking for the protection of my own money. That's the deal. Take it or find it somewhere else. Greg looked like I'd struck him, but they had nowhere else to find $80,000. And so on a grey afternoon in March of 2014 in a title company office that smelled of burnt coffee, we all signed. My name went on that deed in black ink. Adeline R. Marsh, joint tenant with right of survivorship. The closing agent slid me a copy, and I folded it into my purse, and I watched Brielle watch me do it. And I knew, the way you know weather, that she had filed that moment away as a humiliation she would someday repay. I should have understood then what that meant. I'm telling you now so you'll understand it faster than I did. When you protect yourself in front of someone who sees your dignity as an insult to theirs, you don't end the war. You start the clock. For 10 years I was the help. I'll spare you the full catalogue, but I want you to feel the shape of it. I babysat my grandchildren, 2 of them, a boy and a girl I love more than my own breath. Every time Brielle wanted a weekend away, and I was never once thanked, only scheduled. I was invited to holidays and seated where you'd seat a difficult relative you couldn't disinvite. When I brought food, Brielle would thank me brightly, and then I'd watch it sit untouched while her mother's catered dishes got passed around. One Christmas I overheard her tell a friend in the hallway, not quite quietly enough, that Greg's mother insists on coming. It's easier to just let her. I stood in that hallway holding a tray of the cookies my grandchildren had begged me to bring, and I felt something in me go very still and very cold. I didn't make a scene. I never made a scene. I went home, and I opened my book and I wrote the date, and I wrote what she said, and underneath it I wrote, "She has forgotten who holds the paper." What none of them knew, what they could not have imagined, was that across those same 10 years I had not been idle. While they spent, I tracked. The mortgage on that house in Dublin was in both their names and mine. The truck Greg drove, a $60,000 thing he'd financed at the height of his pride, had been refinanced once through a credit union where I happened to know, from decades of bookkeeping, exactly how the paperwork worked. And the joint investment account Greg had opened to manage Mum's contributions, the one he'd had me sign on to in 2016 so I could help with the deposits, still had my name as a primary holder. He'd forgotten. People forget the boring paperwork. They remember the dinners and forget the documents, and that is the single most expensive mistake a proud person can make. By the autumn of 2024, I had, sitting quietly across 3 accounts and the equity in that house, more than $400,000 I had legal standing to claim. I had never touched it as a weapon. I never intended to. I told myself I was just being my mother's daughter, keeping the books, protecting against a rainy day. I was 68 years old, and I thought the worst was behind me, that I would fade out gently as the difficult mother-in-law who came to holidays. And then came Thanksgiving. The dinner was at the Dublin house, the one with my name on the deed, though I doubt a single person at that table remembered that fact. Brielle's whole family was there, her parents, her sister and brother-in-law, who I'd met maybe twice, a couple of neighbours, 11 people, plus me. I had been up since 4, making the pie my grandson asks for by name, the brown butter pecan that takes 3 hours and a steady hand, and I had driven the 40 minutes through cold rain with it warm on the passenger seat beside me, belted in like a child. I came in through the kitchen. The kitchen I had paid $18,000 to remodel 2 years earlier, when Brielle had cried to Greg that the cabinets were embarrassing, and Greg had come to me, and I had written the cheque because I always wrote the cheque. Brielle was at the island, plating appetizers, and when she saw me, she did not say hello. She looks at the pie in my hands, and then she looks at me, and she said, in a voice pitched so the room beyond could hear it, "Oh, you're here? Listen, the dining room is really set for family, and it's tight. Why don't you just wait out in the garage until we've done the main meal? I'll fix you a plate after. There's a chair out there." The garage. I want you to understand that I had spent $50,000 by my own careful count on that family across 10 years. I want you to understand that my name was on the deed of the floor she was standing on, and she was sending me to wait by the lawnmower like a delivery I was too early for. Greg was in the doorway. He heard it. I watched my son hear his wife send his mother to the garage on Thanksgiving, and I watched him look at the floor, and I watched him say nothing. That was the moment. Not Brielle's words. Brielle was always going to be Brielle. It was Greg's silence. It was the flaw he found so interesting. 40 years of cold I'd driven through for that boy, and he could not lift his eyes off the tile. I set the pie down on the island, very gently, because it deserved gentleness, even if no one in that house did. I said, "That's all right. I won't trouble the family." My voice was steady. I have a steady voice. It served me well. And I picked up my coat, and I walked back out the front door into the cold rain, and I got into my 15-year-old Buick, and I did not cry, because I was already doing arithmetic. Brielle thought she'd won something that morning. She thought she'd finally put the help in her place. What she'd actually done was the only thing that could ever have unlocked the thing I'd kept locked for 10 years. She'd made it necessary. I drove home, and I did not turn on the television, and I did not call my sister. I sat at my kitchen table with the ledger, the new one, and I made a list the way my mother taught me, in order, each item a line. By the time the rain stopped, I had a plan, and the plan was not revenge. I want to be precise because the comments always argue about this. It was not revenge. Revenge is hot and stupid, and it cost you more than it cost them. What I did was colder than revenge. It was a reckoning. It was the books, finally balanced. Monday morning I was waiting outside the credit union when it opened. The joint investment account, the one Greg had forgotten my name was on, held $191,000. I did not take all of it. I took exactly the sum I could document I had put in across the years, plus the modest interest it had earned, down to the dollar. $146,218. I had the deposit records in a folder going back to 2016, because of course I did. The young man who helped me looked nervous when he saw the figure and went to get his manager, and the manager looked at my identification and my paperwork and asked, almost kindly, if everything was all right at home. My family sent me to wait in the garage on Thanksgiving, I said. I'm simply collecting what's mine before I go. I have never seen a man process a transaction faster. Then I went to my attorney. His name was Walt, and he'd done my will and Russell's estate, and he was as old as me and twice as ornery, and he had warned me back in 2014 when I told him I'd insisted on the deed, that I was buying myself trouble. You were right and you were wrong, Walt, I told him, sitting across his desk. It was trouble. And thank God I bought it. Here is what the law allowed. And I checked every step, because I have spent my life inside other people's finances, and I knew exactly where the lines were, and I did not cross a single one. I was a joint tenant on the Dublin house with right of survivorship, which meant I had a legal ownership interest I could act on. I could not simply throw them out, and I didn't try. But I could force a partition, a legal sale of the property to divide the proceeds among the owners, and I could file to recover the documented sums I'd loaned that had never been formalized as gifts. Because I had every check and every memo line, 10 years of write it down sitting in a folder thick as a Bible. Walt looked through that folder for a long time, then he took off his glasses and he said, Addie, in 40 years I have never seen a client this organized. They never had a chance. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel when you finally set down something heavy you've carried so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. The papers were filed by Wednesday. I won't pretend the next months were quiet. Greg called 41 times. I counted because I count. The first calls were confused, then frightened, then when his lawyer explained to him exactly how solid my position was, furious. He left a voicemail I still have, in which he called me vindictive, called me cruel, said I was destroying his family over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, as though I'd wandered into the garage by accident. Brielle's father got involved, the 3 dealership man and his lawyer called Walt, and Walt called me, and I could hear him almost laughing. They wanted to know if you'd settle quietly, he said. I told them you'd be happy to settle for exactly what you're legally owed, not $1 more, and they about fell out of their chairs because exactly what you're legally owed is more than they can pay without selling that house. They sold the house. They had to. The partition forced it, and the market was good. And after the mortgage was cleared, my share of the equity came to a little over $90,000. The truck, it turned out, had been refinanced through that same credit union with me as a co-signer Greg had forgotten about. And when the loan went into trouble during all this, I exercised my right to be removed from the obligation in a way that left him holding all of it, and he couldn't carry it. And it went back. I didn't take his truck out of spite. I took my name off a debt I never should have been on, and the debt did the rest. By spring of 2025 it was finished. I had recovered, all told, $312,000 and change. Every dollar of it documented, every dollar of it mine, taken back through the front door of the law, in daylight with receipts. Now here is the part the comments always ask about, so let me answer it before you wonder. People say, if you got all that money, why are you living simple? Why the little apartment? Why the same old Buick? Because I chose it, that's why. I am 68 years old, and I have spent my whole life proving I could be careful with money. I have nothing left to prove, and nobody left to impress. I took an apartment near the river in a town an hour from anyone who knew my name, with a window that gets the morning light, and I pay my rent on the 1st of every month, and I owe no one anything. The money isn't for a bigger life. It's for freedom, and freedom doesn't look like much from the outside. That's the secret nobody tells you. It looks like a quiet woman with good light and a paid bill. And the safe deposit box. I promised you the safe deposit box. 3 days after Thanksgiving, while I was pulling my documents together, I went to the bank to open my own deposit box, the first one I'd ever rented in my name alone. And the clerk, going through my records, found that Russell had opened 1 decade earlier that I'd never known about. He paid the fee in advance for 30 years and never told me. I sat in that little private room and they brought me the box and I opened it, and inside was an envelope in my husband's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before he died, as if some part of him had known. It wasn't money. It was the deed to the very first house we ever owned, the little place in the coal town, the one we'd sold in 1998. He'd kept the original deed, and clipped to it was a note. Addie, if you're reading this, I'm gone and I'm sorry I didn't say this enough. You are the smartest person I ever met. You always knew the worth of things when nobody else did. Don't ever let anyone, not even Greg, make you forget what you're worth. Keep your own books. I love you. Rare, keep your own books. I sat in that room for a long time. I'm not ashamed to say I wept, the only time I wept in the whole of it. Not over the money, not over Greg, not over Brielle and her brave colours and her family seating charts. I wept because my husband had reached forward across 16 years to tell me the one thing I needed to hear on the worst week of my life, which was that the woman they'd sent to the garage had been worth seeing all along. Greg writes to me now. Letters, not calls, because I don't answer the phone. He's divorced. Brielle left when the money did, which tells you everything about what she married. He's renting an apartment smaller than mine. He wrote in the last letter that he understands now, that he's ashamed, that he was a coward in that doorway, and he knows it. He asked carefully if there was a road back. I haven't written back. I haven't thrown the letters away either. I keep them in a drawer with the ledger, and maybe someday the cold I feel will thaw enough to pick up a pen. My grandchildren I see now without him as the gate, because they're old enough to drive themselves to my door, and they do, and we bake the pie together, the brown butter pecan, and I'm teaching my granddaughter to keep a book of her own. I'm Adeline Marsh. I'm 68 years old. On Thanksgiving morning, my family sent me to wait in the garage, and instead I walked out the front door and took back everything I was owed, not out of hate, out of arithmetic, out of dignity, out of 40 years of writing it down. My mother was right, and my husband was right, and I'll say it to you now, the way they said it to me, so you don't learn it as late as I did. Memory fades, paper doesn't. Keep your own books, and never ever let them tell you to wait in the garage. The garage wasn't the cruelest thing that happened to me. The cruelest thing was how long I let myself believe that being needed was the same as being loved. I drove through black ice for Greg when he was born. I wrote checks I told myself were generosity when really they were a kind of bargaining. A quiet hope that if I gave enough, they'd finally make room for me at the table. They never did, and the hard truth I had to sit with, alone in that apartment with the good morning light, is that nobody could put me in the garage until I'd spent 10 years carrying my own chair out there. Here's what I've come to understand about how it all unspooled. None of it was an accident. Brielle treated me like the help because I let her, year after year, swallowing it, refilling her glass, writing it down, but never acting. Greg looked at the floor in that doorway because he'd been practicing that exact silence since he was 25, and a man becomes whatever he rehearses. And I got to walk out with what was mine. Not because I got lucky, but because 40 years earlier my mother put a coffee can ledger above the stove and taught me that the day you stop counting is the day someone starts stealing. Every effect in this story had a cause. The mercy of that, the real mercy, is that it means you are never as powerless as they want you to feel. If I could reach back and tell my younger self one thing, it wouldn't be about money. It would be about 3 things I had to learn in the wrong order. The first is to keep your honesty even when no one rewards it, because the woman who never fudged a decimal for 40 years was the same woman they couldn't beat in a courtroom. Character isn't soft. Character is the thing that holds when everything else gives way. The second is to use the head God gave you and stop confusing being kind with being a doormat. I had the deed. I had the records. Wisdom isn't knowing things. It's having the clarity to act on what you know before the resentment eats you alive. And the third is the hardest, because it's the willingness to do the cold, slow, unglamorous work of standing up for yourself, when it would be so much easier to keep quiet and bake another pie. It took more strength to walk out that front door without a tear than it ever took to walk back in for 10 Thanksgivings. I'm 68. I don't say any of this from a mountaintop. I say it from a small apartment by a river, with a paid bill on the counter, and my granddaughter learning to keep a book of her own at my kitchen table. You don't have to wait until you're my age to learn it. Be honest when it costs you. Be smart enough to protect what's yours. And be strong enough to walk away from anyone who measures your worth by how much you'll endure. Keep your own books. The numbers always come due.